In 218 BC, a man led 37 war elephants over the highest mountains in Europe, in winter. By the time he reached the other side, almost half his army was dead. And here's the part nobody tells you. He hadn't even reached the enemy yet. Think about what that actually means. No maps, no roads, no supply lines, snow up to a soldier's chest, on paths barely wide enough for a single man, let alone a 6-ton animal that had never seen ice in its life. Every instinct says this should be impossible. So why would anyone even try it? Because the obvious route was a trap. Rome ruled the sea. Their navy patrolled every coastline between Carthage and Italy. If Hannibal sailed, he'd be intercepted and sunk before he ever landed a single soldier. So he did the one thing Rome could never plan for. He decided to attack Italy from the north, overland, through territory Rome was certain no army could ever cross. To understand why a man would gamble an entire army on a frozen mountain, you have to understand what he was carrying. When Hannibal was a boy, his father made him swear an oath at an altar, that he would be the eternal enemy of Rome. Carthage had already lost one war to them, stripped of territory, drowned in debt, humiliated. This wasn't just a campaign. For Hannibal, it was the entire reason he existed, and he intended to finish it on Roman soil. And that was the whole point of the mountains. The Alps weren't an obstacle Hannibal had to survive. They were a weapon. A wall everyone assumed was solid, that he intended to walk straight through. If he made it, he'd appear in Rome's backyard like a ghost. An army that, by every Roman calculation, simply could not exist. He started from Spain with a force that staggers the imagination. Somewhere around 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and those 37 elephants. Animals meant to terrify men who'd never faced them. For weeks they pushed up through hostile valleys, fighting local tribes the entire way. People who knew these mountains, people who did not want a foreign army walking through their home. But the tribes were just the warm-up. The mountain itself was waiting. First came a problem no one in his army had solved. A wide, fast river, the Rhone. And on the far bank, thousands of Gallic warriors waiting to slaughter his men as they crossed. So Hannibal split his force. He sent part of his army upstream in the dark to slip across and circle behind the enemy. At dawn, as the Gauls focused on the river, smoke rose at their backs, and they broke. But the men were the easy part. He still had to get the elephants across deep, rushing water. And here's where you see how his mind worked. His engineers lashed together enormous rafts and piled earth on top until they looked like solid ground. They led the elephants out onto what the animals believed was dry land, and then cut the rafts loose and floated them across. Some panicked, plunging into the river and wading along the bottom with only their trunks above the surface. But they made it. Every last one reached the far bank, and the hardest part hadn't even begun. As they climbed into the Alps, the air thinned and the temperature dropped. The trail narrowed until it clung to the edge of sheer cliffs, with a drop on one side that fell away into nothing. Pack animals slipped on the ice and vanished over the side, taking food and supplies with them. Men froze in their sleep and were left where they lay. And the elephants, confused, starving, terrified, were coaxed forward step by step, along ledges that crumbled under their weight. Then they hit the moment that should have ended everything. The mountain tribes had been watching them the whole time. They waited until the column was strung out thin along the narrowest ledges. then rolled boulders down from above and rushed the line. There was nowhere to run. On one side, the rock wall. On the other, the abyss. Hannibal seized a high position above the trail in the night and held it through the chaos. He saved the army. But the screams of men and horses falling into the dark stayed with the survivors for life. And then, near the summit, the path itself betrayed them. A landslide had wiped out the trail ahead, a gap in the rock too wide and too steep to cross. The army was trapped on a freezing mountainside with almost no food left. This is where the legend gets strange. According to the Roman historian Livy, they built fires against the rock face and heated the stone until it cracked. Then they poured sour wine into the fractures to split it apart and chipped a road out of the mountain by hand.
Now, did that really happen? Historians still argue about it. The chemistry doesn't quite work the way Livy describes, and some scholars think it's a story that grew taller with each retelling. But strip away the legend, and the hard fact remains. Hannibal crossed. In 15 days, he got an army and his surviving elephants over a barrier the most powerful empire on Earth treated as a closed door. The cost, though, was staggering. He had left Spain with tens of thousands of men. He came down the far side of the Alps with around 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Do the math on that. He had lost more than half of everything before a single Roman soldier ever saw him. And this is exactly where most people assume the story turns into a disaster. A broken, frost-bitten force stumbling into the heart of the enemy. Surely now Rome would crush him. It went the other way entirely. Rome was stunned. They genuinely believed the Alps made an invasion from the north impossible, so they had no army positioned to stop one. Hannibal didn't just survive the mountains. He used them to erase Rome's home field advantage completely. He arrived where he was least expected, against an enemy that had prepared for the wrong war, on the wrong coast, facing the wrong direction. And what came next is why we still say his name 2,000 years later. He didn't wait to be attacked. He went hunting. At the river Trebia, he lured an overeager Roman army across icy water on an empty stomach, hid his brother with a force in the reeds, and shattered them the moment they were cold and exhausted. Then at Lake Trasimene, he hid an entire army in the morning fog along the shore and let a full Roman column march straight into the trap. Thousands were driven into the water in minutes, one of the largest ambushes in military history. And Rome still hadn't seen his masterpiece. At Cannae, he faced a Roman force nearly twice his size, the largest army Rome had ever put in the field. So he did the opposite of everything a commander is supposed to do. He let his weakest troops form the center and pushed them forward, inviting the Romans to charge in. As the legions pressed deeper, certain they were winning, his line bent backward like a bow. And then his cavalry and veterans folded the wings around them and sealed them in. In a single afternoon, tens of thousands of Romans were surrounded and destroyed. It's still taught in military academies as the perfect battle, the dream every general since has tried to recreate. Think about what that means. The elephant gamble had worked. The impossible crossing had paid off beyond anyone's wildest expectation. He had walked through a mountain, lost half his army, and still annihilated the greatest military power on Earth. 3 times. So why isn't this a story about how Hannibal conquered Rome? Because winning every battle and winning the war are 2 completely different things. Hannibal could destroy Roman armies,
What he couldn't do was destroy Rome's will. After Cannae, by some accounts, Rome had lost a fifth of all its men of fighting age in a single summer. Any other state in the ancient world would have surrendered on the spot. Rome did the opposite. They refused to even negotiate. They lowered the age of recruitment, armed slaves, and raised new legions out of the ashes. For every army he wiped out, they built another. And then they did the one thing his genius couldn't answer. They stopped fighting him. A Roman general named Fabius realized the truth. You cannot beat Hannibal in a battle, so don't give him one. The Romans shadowed his army, cut off his supplies, and refused every challenge. No glory, no grand clash, just patience. They mocked Fabius and called it cowardice. But it worked. The greatest tactical mind of the ancient world had walked through a mountain to reach an enemy that would not break, and now would not even fight. And what about the elephants? The symbol of the whole impossible march. Almost all were already gone. The cold, the climb, and the starvation of that first brutal winter in Italy killed nearly every animal that survived the crossing. The legend says only one was left alive. A single elephant, Hannibal himself, is said to have ridden through the marshes, the last of 37. The weapon that was meant to terrify Rome melted away in the Italian mud. And still, the man fought on. For more than a decade, Hannibal roamed Italy, unbeaten and unable to land the final blow. So Rome did something brutal in its simplicity. They ignored him. They raised a young, brilliant commander named Scipio, sailed for Hannibal's homeland, and attacked Carthage directly. Suddenly, it was Hannibal's own city about to fall. After 15 years, he was forced to abandon Italy and rush home to defend it. And there, on a dusty plain called Zama, the trick finally turned against him. His own elephants panicked and turned back into his lines, and he was beaten. Once. One defeat after a lifetime of victories. The elephants, the Alps, Cannae. All of it ended on a field in Africa. So was crossing the Alps a triumph or a tragedy? It was both. It was the most audacious military gamble in history, executed by maybe the most brilliant commander who ever lived. And it still wasn't enough, because Hannibal proved something every empire forgets at its peril. You can win every fight and still lose, if your enemy simply decides they will never, ever quit. He marched elephants over the Alps to beat Rome at war. Rome's answer was to lose and lose and lose again, and keep standing anyway. So who really won? The genius who never lost a battle, or the empire too stubborn to admit it was beaten? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe, because at Empire Archives, we keep tracing exactly how the greatest powers in history rise and how they fall.